Thank you again, everyone, for coming to this Monday Majlis. This is the last one of our spring term, and in it clashes for many of you with the Ramadan, and thank you very much for coming in spite of that. And yes, so it is dedicated to Hayrettin's trajectory and research, which I'm most excited about to hear. So I actually won't do much introduction, because I would only praise Hayrettin, and then listening to him give him more praise than I could formulate. But so I found he works on these early intellectuals in Islam in various ways, and he's going to talk about his most recent book, which hasn't been published yet, but I had the joy to read parts of it, and he will specifically talk about Abdul Hamid al-Khatib, and then my dear friend Ibn al-Muqaffa.
Of course.
So yes.
Mostly Ibn al-Muqaffa, actually.
Okay, then that will be sheer delight for all of us, and surely for me. Thank you, Hayrettin. I stop. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Iswan, for this wonderful opportunity to let me talk about my research and my forthcoming book. And thank you to Sarah as well, who facilitated the connection. And thank you to all of you who are attending, and those people who cannot attend that emailed me because of variety of other obligations they had. So what I'm going to be doing is to talk about my work in the kitchen a little bit, in completing my book about what I called finally the Disenchanting the Caliphate, which is going to appear from the Columbia University Press this summer. And then I will talk about some of the themes that I try to develop in the book, based on a close reading of early and mid 8th century texts, such as Abdul Hamid's writings, Ibn al-Muqaffa's writings, and also including, since I make a distinction between imamat and siyasa, I also include several early 8th century texts, Salim bin Dhakwan's Risala, and also Risala fil Irja by Al-Hasan ibn Muhammad al-Hanafiya, and Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, and few other texts that I will put into conversation with each other to see how two distinct political thought traditions emerged in the middle of the 8th century, and then we should really recognize them as such, rather than leave them and amorphous structures of political thought under one umbrella. So I will be more systematic in my presentation. If you leave me, I will chat like this, but probably it's going to be a very confusing discussion. So I will get the help of the PowerPoint presentation so that I follow some kind of really systematic in here. Would you mind if I share my PowerPoint with you guys? All right, let me see here. All right. All right. Now, I guess, I presume you see the PowerPoint. Okay. And sorry that, I am looking up because my camera is down, but I had to look at the computer screen in here. So just forgive my posture in here. Well, I have been interested in political thought since my graduate years in Jordan, then at Chicago. And I published my master thesis in Arabic in 1990, in which I developed the the formation of the Sunni political thought, which I pursued since then, actually, in variety of articles that I published. And my research on Abdul Hamid and Ibn al-Mukaffa also comes out of that really research. There were certain quality to the writings of both persons that I just could not really just, ignoring or not looking at. Then I was interested in world history and empires, and I thought their thoughts was also relevant in that context. So I started to think about, both figures, in particular Ibn al-Hamid, in the context of world history and empires, and try to figure out how we can actually just discuss their writings in that context. And obviously, as a scholar, like everybody else in this room, that thinking about what we are doing in terms of self-reflection, you want to locate where you stand. And this brought me into thinking about theory in the context of Orientalism, in the context of nativism, in the context of post-coloniality and decoloniality, that I thought also was very relevant to the research I was doing, simply because, you want to situate yourself as a scholar, and also to be, upfront with your own pre-commitments and biases, so that, you let the reader knows where you stand in matters. And obviously doing that, I had critical engagement with the ideas and writings about the liberal modernity, Orientalism, and the discourse of Islam, which I see that, emerging really only in the 19th century onward, which I will be talking about a little bit more in detail later on. And then the ideas about, world history, and the kind of really looking at the world not through the lenses of a Eurocentric perspective, but really trying to, as one scholar called it, provincializing the continent as one of the continents in the world, and one of the subject fields of world history rather than the center of our discussion. And I have also some kind of really back and forth with the idea of historical periods, that Hegelian trajectory, linear progress of history and the like, but also about the idea of modern, pre-modern. These are, at the end of the day, constructs that lend themselves to a kind of really productive engagement that I have not get out of yet, but at the same time, I just want you to know that, I operate on this, on this problematic as well. I'm not very comfortable with the idea of mid-modern and pre-modern, not only because it is Eurocentric, but at the same time, because we know it is a construct, and that, that needs some kind of really critical analysis. And with that, I really benefited from my readings of Latour and his book, We Have Never Been Modern, right? The question that he raises over that, I think, is useful for, people in our field as well, to think about how we conduct our scholarship. So, I have, just to talking about my book that I am, in the process of proofreading right now, that, I had a couple of motivations that pushed me into writing this book. One is that, I wanted really to trace a genealogy of non-theological political discourses in the region, which is something that, how can I really talk about political thought without centering the ulama? And the second is that, I'd like to just basically decenter and relativize the ulama-centric political theology, that, as a starting point, I thought that, ulama obviously developed great political ideas in history, that some of which I will be talking about in here too, but at the same time, they formed only one political tradition among other political tradition, that I think spelling that out and trying to see the kind of really develops out of that notion, that framework, is an important motivation for me as well. And also, I wanted to critique and nuance modern historiography of political thought. I will be talking about this a little bit more in detail just shortly. So I will keep it at that right now. And another one was basically to do a contextual close reading of a major political text or major text to understand political thought and empire. This is something that I really like a lot, not only because I want to focus on text and read them carefully, but also I am thinking about it in the context of what Edward Said was calling as contrapuntal reading, trying to understand the empire through reading a text. Really, what kind of really counterpoints that we can see by reading this text. So let me just move forward in here as well. And obviously, doing that, I recognize the challenge of facing the basic terminology that we are operating with. The only thing I want to say in this context right now is that every single one of them, every single concept that I mention in here, I deal with critically in the introduction of my forthcoming book. Religion, issues about secularism, secularity, whether they are modern, whether they are European or not, medieval modern, and the idea or the notion of Islamic political thought. So, we will be mentioning some of them, but, I just wanted to let you know that I do deal with each one of them specifically. I keep using some of them, obviously, because, come to the idea is that how can I speak otherwise, right? Because, you write this book in English, you write it to the contemporary readers, there is some kind of really structural things that, you have to basically engage. So that puts you into a kind of really just basically a corner that it's very difficult to get out, right? There is a, phrase by Albert Memmi that I use in my book as well, is that, he talks about the subaltern and colonized intellectuals that, if they wanted to be heard, they must speak really in the language of the colonizer. So, we have to basically, there is that kind of difficulty that is very well known, obviously, in the translation studies in today. How do you translate a book from one language to another? What is the politics of that? There is some kind of really similar dynamic in here. How do you speak about these matters? Using vocabulary that is really just basically polluted with the developments in the last 1 or 2 centuries. And here I would like to talk about Islamic political thought. Needless to say, we use it right and left, and I am guilty of that as well, right? We talk about Islamic political thought, Muslim political thought, without really any second thought. But I'd like to point out that the act of naming something, the framing something, is very important, because it frames or it brings the object in question to a new light. It creates a reality, and to a certain extent, it allows a control over it. I'd like you to think this way. What kind of really secular political thought tradition can we talk about if the field is defined as Islamic? What kind of really secularity one could find if the field defined as Islamic. So I think, I have become very irritated about that, right? I mean, that, what is the way to talk about political thought tradition without centering it on the idea of Islamic religiosity? This is obviously not disrespect to Islamic religiosity or to religiosity, just simply, to find a space of exploration and for, deliberation and intellectual thought that is not really necessarily defined by the implications of this, on this framework. And here, I'll give you a couple of, questions to think about. Well, it may not be a common knowledge that the phrase Islamic political thought itself appeared during the European colonial aggression in Asia and Africa, and in the struggles against colonialism in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century. It is a quite recent definition, as some of you probably may have guessed or may guess. It was in this period that the European Enlightenment's triumphalist civilizational outlook, systematizing scientific discourses, and their concomitant intellectual habits and knowledge structures reshaped the language of both Orientalists and Europe-oriented Muslim intellectuals. As Jamil Aydin shows in his The Idea of the Muslim World, officers and Orientalist scholars refer to discrete peoples and empires in Afro-Eurasia as the Muslim world in ways that defined the Muslim peoples racially and essentialized their religious beliefs and cultures as separate from and inferior to that of Western civilization. Islam emerged as a discourse signifying a religious totality, covering all aspects of life, on behalf of which one can speak and according to which one can judge. So let me talk about two fundamental Muslim intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century, which I see as playing a large part in the birth of that label. And one of them is Muhammad Iqbal, and the other one, Harun Khan Shirwani. And I really don't like to talk long about this subject because there are some other very important matters that I'd like to actually speak about more. But as far as I can tell, and if you know anything else, I'll be happy obviously to hear, is that the first time that I see Islamic political thought and Muslim political thought used in writing in the English language, and I did not see any corresponding phrase to it in French and German, is the first decade of the 20th century by Muhammad Iqbal in his article in the Sociological Review. This is the first person to use that definition. And there are a couple of other scholars used it afterwards. But really, when we talk about the field of Islamic political thought, by the way, I was one of the contributors of also the Princeton Encyclopedia of Islamic Political Thought. So, I'm including myself in that really group. So I'm criticizing myself as well, right? And the second person that is very important is Harun Khan Shirwani, who is obviously a colleague of Iqbal in India as well, who has written the work of studies in the history of early Muslim political thought and administration in 1942. If we would like to think about the field of Islamic political thought, by starting with, Rosenthal, then, Watt, Montgomery Watt, A.K.S. Lampton, Patricia Crone, and the others, well, Harun Khan Shirwani is really the cornerstone in that history of, the history of the concept. So, I'm going to be leaving it at that. But I do talk about this matter in the introduction of my book as well, so that, not to think about the phrase itself or the title itself as something natural, something very descriptive, something that is really actually just, basically, discussing or signifying a standing reality. It is actually a framework, theoretical framework, that we must critically engage. All right. So let me talk about my argument, both in this talk and also in my book. My argument is that political thought traditions prevalent in the Caliphate world in the middle decades of the long 8th century diverged in two dialogic regimes of rationality. The religious governance of the ulama, elaborated in what I call imamate discourse, and the secular politics of lay bureaucrat literati, expressed in the discursive tradition of siyasa. Initially emerging in the crucibles of imperial bureaucracy and separate from quote-unquote scholastic knowledge connected with mosques and ulama, siyasa discourse exposed the distinction between the ulama-centric idea of the caliphate and royal authority, khilafah and mulk. The dialogic engagement between the two shaped the contours of not only the Abbasid Caliphate, but also what historical thought traditions from the 8th century onward. So with this really main argument, I bring the question of siyasa and secularity. My argument concerns the thorny question of religiosity and secularity. In the discursive practices of what I call the adab siyasa ethos, we observe a new space of reflection on issues that remained outside the interest of the evolving religious scholarly disciplines, which on the one hand acted as a countervailing force to the value and prestige of religious discourse, and on the other hand developed a new knowledge structure that seemed unintelligible to the ulama. In this context, Ibn al-Muqaffa's argument about the difference between religion and reason, al-din wal-aql, as everybody, but particularly Iswan knows well, in the epistle must be underlined. According to this pioneering thinker of siyasa, each one of these two categories authorizes a distinct practice and subject. It is important to remember the notions of revealed law, the world, deen, dunya, and revelation, reason, wahi, and aql. Ibn al-Muqaffa already suggests in his Al-Adab al-Kabir a distinction between the forms of engagement with religion and with the world, deen and dunya. He also notes the need for a differential treatment of religion and the body, deen and jasad, which demands balancing the two to complete the self. Viewed in the long trajectory of history, these concerns for moral and mundane self-formation mobilized two distinct technologies of self-management that may be captured as caring for the body, صحة البدن, صحة الجسد, and knowledge interrogation of the self, معرفة or محاسبة النفس. I must note that the emerging notion of adab as a manner or department distinct from the concept of religious dutifulness, taqwa, and renunciant piety, zuhd, which functioned as practices of moral self-formation and techniques of self-representation. And this is really happening in the 8th century, the century that I care to talk about in my book and in this presentation.
Excuse me, Hayrettin. This I'm completely blown up. It's immensely interesting. I just want to ask everyone whether you can see very well the PowerPoint, or it would be better to have the actual text bigger, because on mine it's just in the middle of the shed.
Let me enlarge it. Is that better?
For me, it is much better. Is it the same?
That's better.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
I think you need to click slideshow. If you click slideshow,
But this is already good.
Is this good?
Yeah, this is very good.
Okay. So, I mean, just to make really the distinction a little bit better, if you read, and when you read the 8th century texts on the imamate, that, by the scholars that I already mentioned, and even later on, but later on they have, different really questions that, I'm not going to be able to get into in here. You're going to see that, I mean, they already started to develop into two distinct really lines. As a discursive representation of the caliphate, the imamate was a particular rationality of governance grounded in Islamic normative values. The imamate corresponded broadly to the notion of religious governance, the governance of the imam, and the ruler, or the ruler who was meant to wield religious and secular authority combined. At the imamate's core lay the requisite that the Muslim community must have a legitimate leader who would be responsible for, as al-Mawardi would note later, when the term siyasa was no longer snubbed by the ulama, upholding the revealed law and managing the affairs of the world, including such duties as protecting and promoting the faith, implementing laws, defending borders, leading the army, and the other duties that I'm not going to be mentioning right now. Some of the best descriptions and elaboration of the imamate appear in primary source texts on Aqidah and Kalam, Fiqh, Hadith, Kutub al-Firaq, by the ulama, such as the piety-oriented or mutadayyin jurists or legal scholars, faqih fuqaha, hadith transmitters, theologians, mutakallimin, and other scholars from any sect or school. And obviously, I'm not glossing over the difference within the imamate discourse. There are different trends in imamate discourse, the list of which that radically differs from the other branches or other currents of thoughts in the imamate discourse, is the Muslim anarchists in the early 9th century that do not see really imamate as necessary. But nevertheless, these are, this is the really framework that that hold them all together. It is vital to note that the imamate had been the only language available to make sense of the political reality until siyasa emerged as its contestant in the mid 8th century. So if we want to talk about the early political thought in the late Umayyad and early Abbasid times, we can only, we can make sense of the political reality through the lenses of the imamate. There was nothing else. And siyasa intervenes in that really junction. And that's why, I call it, for example, just, disruptive, because it intervenes in such a way that immediately relativizes the discourse of imamate to make sense of the political reality. Okay, so my second point, obviously, in my argument is the language of siyasa. As a counterpoint to the idea of the imamate, siyasa emerged as another discourse of constituting and representing the caliphate based on the idea of royal authority, mulk. Siyasa emerged in the crucibles of the Umayyad and early Abbasid imperial administration among a cadre of pivotal lay bureaucrat literati who launched a discussion of politics in the early literary prose writing, apart from the quote-unquote scholastic knowledge of the ulama. So it is not only what is emerging, it is not only just basically a different idea, it is also a different language. And I think, probably during the question and answer time that we can discuss that a little bit more in detail. The proponents of siyasa intervened from two directions. First, they foregrounded the idea of good governance as an endeavor distinct from the practice of religious piety. Second, they opened a new field of deliberation in which secular political moralities that could be later on, obviously, philosophical, ethical, and realist, were expressed and elaborated. By making a non-ulama-centric sense of political reality in an epoch in which religious scholars imagined only a community of faith and its governing body, the proponents of siyasa conceptualized governance as a craft of building satisfaction through the rational and practical calculation of the contingency in consideration of the outcome. I'd like you to remember here, both Abdul Hamid and Ibn Muqaffa's discussion about siyasa as sina'a here, as a craft. Let me move forward. So, just to give you a context, and I'm just going to basically pass very quickly from here. This discourse is evolving in the late Umayyad decades and the early decades of the Abbasid, when the Abbasid revolt really happened in the middle of that century. And I focused my attention in my research on the intersection of the bureaucratic craft, the emergence of the political prose, and the political practice of the late Umayyads and the early Abbasid in the works of Abdul Hamid and Ibn al-Muqaffa. So, I feel shy about talking about Ibn al-Muqaffa in here, because there are, the masters who studied Ibn al-Muqaffa more than I have been. But, nevertheless, for those people who have not studied Ibn al-Muqaffa, these are really the simple biographic information about his life, and there are a lot of obviously unknowns about his biography. But nevertheless, this is both an excellent bureaucrat, also and really inspiring, groundbreaking intellectual. And here it will come to the fore even better when I show you this current slide. I'm not going to be talking about all of this work, and we can discuss them in more detail if there is a question about them, and Iswan is in here who can actually just do it much better than I can. But I'd like to make one point about this finding. Looking at this list, including the ones that are attributed to him but are not his, tell us one thing, that this guy is a political thinker. This guy is a political machine. He has done nothing but writing about politics. So, we have to recognize them. We recognize him for that quality. The second point that, I'd like to make, about this point is that we take this oftentimes for granted. Until Abdul Hamid and Ibn al-Muqaffa, nobody wrote about politics. But, there is a discussion about that in the book, and hopefully I will talk about this one as well within the context of the Salem school of siyasa. There are a couple of individuals in that circle who wrote about politics. Salih ibn Abi al-Ala is, included, obviously, Abdul Hamid and Ibn al-Muqaffa. But, my point was different. This is the first time that Arabic prose writing begins. So until then, Arabic was not really a prose language. And guess what? Prose language in Arabic began as political prose writing. We see it in the first time in the writings of Abdul Hamid, in the writings of Ibn al-Muqaffa, and both of them wrote political tracts. So, therefore, when we talk about the rise of Arabic prose, we are also talking about the rise of Arabic political prose. So, there is a lot, projection back, for example, from later centuries into this period, and there is also taking the language itself for granted, which obviously should not do. So that's why, I call it intervention, I call it disruption, I call it destabilizing, because, you know, I mean, you operate in an environment in which the things that you are doing have not been there. So, you know, I mean, I will focus in here more about the epistle on the court companions, Risal of Sahaba, and you will notice that, you know, I will rename this epistle as the epistle on the caliph's privy. So, you know, there is, because I want to make it also, as the epistle itself intended, more really political, rather than giving the sense of the religious Sahaba. In fact, there is a discussion in the book about it, is that, you know, I mean, this kind of dialectic between the two notions that are emerging at the time, that the Sahaba in the middle of the 8th century, when this Risala was written, the concept Sahaba was not already a complete transformation into signifying the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. There is a battle over that was going on, that I think Ibn al-Muqaffa was consciously using it to highlight the political aspect of that notion. We know that he lost that battle, but nevertheless, I think, you know, recognizing that is very important. It's a very short treatise, obviously, as, you know, I indicated in here, and, you know, all of the copies of the epistle came to us in the manuscripts of Tahir ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur, Ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur's Kitab al-Manthur wal-Manzum. Until this book, my book, Disenchanting the Caliphate, we knew only 2 versions of the Risala. Now we have 5 versions. I discovered 3 more manuscripts about a Risala, which, you know, obviously I talk about it in the book as well. I mean, no surprise in here. All of the 5 versions do resemble each other. So, you know, there is no scandalous piece of information in here. But, you know, nevertheless, I think it is good to see, you know, a couple more manuscripts that corroborate the ones that we have. You know, one thing that I need to mention is that, you know, all of the manuscripts that we have until now were really just late 19th century. The one that I discovered, that I sent to Islam as well, is the, you know, 17th century, which is really quite nice. I think it's late 17th century, something like that. But anyways, so I will focus my discussion about the Risala itself in here. And this is one of the copies, the copy that belongs to the late 19th century. I think it's, you know, I mean, this is Darul Kutub al-Masriya. But let's look at briefly at the content of the epistle. I mean, again, I'm not going to be listing, you know, the content. You know, some other scholars, including Iswan, talked about the content of the Risala. Obviously, this is not really that much different from it. But, you know, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. It is a report on policy direction and empire building. It is more than an administrative what to do manual. And it is not an advice for kings, kind of really prototype of that genre. It is a different kind of really writing that looks at specific problems in the imperial administration and advises on. It is not interested in the abstract and timeless language of moral self-construction of the ruler and of his courtly elite, the kind we see, for instance, in his Al-Adab al-Kabir and Kalila and Dimna. You know, this is really different from them. It proposes a way to build a new empire without taking the established order for granted and proceeds in the specific themes of authority, territory, law, military, and courtly elite. It poses questions about organizing the empire politically and apprehends what is political in relations and events. It imagines new mechanisms, structures, and relations to normalize and naturalize political control. It highlights governance as craft, whose principles and practice are a matter of historical knowledge rather than effect of universal and transcendental theological principles that we see in the Imamate discourse. That's why it is not only unique, but it's also groundbreaking, inspiring, and very innovative. It resembles no writing of its time at all, until probably the late 8th century, which I argue were inspired by Ibn al-Muqaffa's writing, particularly the Risala, and I am specifically talking about al-Anbari's writing and also Abu Yusuf's writing. I call them as a governmentalizing religion, based on the practice of Ibn al-Muqaffa in this Risala and in his other writing. Because if you compare al-Anbari's writing to the Imamate discourse before Ibn al-Muqaffa, you are going to see a great difference between the two. And they are, when you put the mediation of Ibn al-Muqaffa's and Abdul Hamid's writing, you're going to see that clearly they were inspired by the form of writing that these two scholars realized. So therefore, well, let me actually just, sorry, I already talked about this one. Let me talk about this aspect of it. So then, therefore, when we look at the epistle, I look at it in terms of its quality, that something stabilizes and relativizes the Imamate discourse of its time. That now it brings something new to the table. It anticipates the discourse of adab, which signify, in this context, gentlemanly, urbane, cultivated, and profane habitus, in contradistinction to the various forms of religious piety, such as taqwa, wara, and zuhd. And here also I'd like to take the adab, to really politicize it, in the sense, to think about the political meaning of adab that is also emerging during this time. And the epistle also is a new language that makes visible the distinction between the language of religious learning and that of the secular learning, which is also, I put it under the umbrella of adab. So, let me just, this is what I deal with in my book, the secularizing practices of good governance. So, how I analyze Ibn al-Muqaffa work is, by really asking a couple of questions to myself. What are the questions or problems Ibn al-Muqaffa, well, sorry about the typo in here, Ibn al-Muqaffa was responding to or pushing back against? So, you can talk about his beliefs, his convictions, by accepting the context as really just static and stable. But then we learn about his own beliefs and convictions. What is really the importance of that? I'd like to talk about his writing in context, in dialogue with the current both practices and discourses of his time, and also to ask the question, what he was trying to do by writing about this subject and by writing about the Abbasid government. What kind of really agenda does he have, by writing this? And maybe even more importantly, when you look at the following decades and centuries, is that what kind of reality does his language create? In what kind of really new light does his writing represent the reality? and what was the potential impact of his language. So I talk about these matters in the context of 4 themes. 1, sovereignty. 2, law. 3, territoriality. And 3, imperial subjectivity. There is a chapter allocated for each one of them. And let's see here. And here I go, I'm not sure if you want to read it or not. But I'm not going to be obviously reading it to you in here, just to make a couple of conclusions about this very fundamental passage actually in the epistle. So obviously Ibn Muqaffa is not a philosopher, and he takes a stab at this subject from, again, a political perspective. It brings the discussion to a political level by naming the question of religion and reason, which I think escaped the previous theologians and jurists of his milieu. Nobody talks about that in the context of politics. In a penetrating analysis of the distinction between the two, he defines revealed law as the revealed knowledge stipulating rituals and obligations that are beyond human capacity. By doing that, actually, he's not opening a new space for religion as he defines it, obviously, in here. He clearly talks about deen and aql. In fact, actually, what he does by first talking about religion is try to limit the space of religion in one's life. And this is what he says in here, as you can see, unlike the foundational assumption of the ulama about religion as the comprehensive universal truth, Ibn al-Muqaffa relativizes it vis-a-vis reason. The critical point is that Ibn al-Muqaffa constructs this, what I call Cartesian duality of religion and reason by describing and defining it along 2 sources of authority, prophetic and political. So, he relativizes religion, limits its reach, and opens a space for reason to guide politics, to guide human life. If you remember his discussion about the law later on, is that, he gives really a very limited space to religion to organize structure and guide human life. So, one must acknowledge that this passage destabilizes rather than complements the existing knowledge about religion and reason in not only politics, but also in epistemology. And I think, we as, students of early Islam and, political thought and Ibn Muqaffa and Abdul Hamid, probably we should think about this passage a little bit more seriously. Think about the implication of this discourse in its time. And later on, obviously, we have a lot of discussion about religion and reason, but thinking about the middle of the 8th century, it is important to keep that in mind. So I mentioned the question of sovereignty. So let me go back to his mentor and friend. And just, I'd like you to read this passage. And as you read it, I will talk about the implication of that in the middle of the 8th century. You're going to see that the word siyasa in this passage, and this is probably one of the first instances we see siyasa expressed, right? At least, what the textual evidence that we have do not really allow us to go any earlier. There is obviously, I'd like to discuss the Kitab al-Siyasa al-Ammiya attributed to Aristoteles and, and all of that. But, we don't have really the copy of that is, agreed on by the scholars, contemporary scholars, whether, we have an original copy. But, it is in the Salim school of Siyasa that the term siyasa emerges. Here, the siyasa signifies the work of the sovereign in dealing with his subjects and the work of the scribe responsible for instructing and advising the sovereign through learned techniques of discipline and education. Like tadbir, siyasa suggests in this passage not a top-down command or forceful suppression, but reaching the goal of improving condition, islah, by strategizing, by managing with stratagems, mutuality, and consent. Abdul Hamid seems to respond to the question of the also, untamable quality of power associated with sovereignty. Well, the impression that you get from this passage is that if one cannot force or oblige the sovereign to act in a certain way or dismiss him, how can one stabilize his power and habituate in him a stable temperament which could allow him to govern in a predictable manner? How, in short, can one train the wild horse not to kick arbitrarily? Both the beast and the sovereign in here share the same status in that they remain outside the law, whereas the beast is beneath the law and cannot be a proper subject of the law. The sovereign is above the law or alongside the law, and although responsible for implementing the law, cannot be held accountable to it. And here, obviously, I am inspired by Jacques Derrida's discussion in his The Beast and the Sovereign. And I think it beautifully applies in here as well. The moderating capacity of siyasa offer a way of bringing the sovereign and the masses, think about the below and above the law distinction in here, within political culture and within the law, so that the social order the sovereign upholds is protected from his own arbitrary power. So, there is something that, I'd like you also to see. Let me skip this one. I'd like you to think about Kalila and Dimna and the famous story between the lion and the jackal, in here. And you can read it on your own, but I'd like to say something about it, what it means in terms of what I am doing. It relates to the previous discussion that I just mentioned about the sovereign and the quality of the sovereignty and being above the law or alongside the law, but not being subject to the law. This is really what the story is telling us at the end of the day. So let me, in here. The king or the lion does not really face any punishment despite his wrongdoings, right? Why? Simply because the lion is the lawgiver who executes the law, but is never subject to it. He is the strainer who is never restrained. So that is really the issue that, I make a distinction between the notion of authority in the imamate discourse and the notion of authority in the siyasa discourse. One of them is based on the idea of mulk, sovereignty, but the other one is based on the idea of basically a contract between the caliph and the community, and the other one, or the contract between the caliph and God. But he can never be a sovereign like we see it in the siyasa discourse, because his power has to conform to religious obligations and to the creator. And here, I want to show you a couple of really tables in here so that, sorry, let me go. So, anybody studying the subject would know that the idea of imamate represented in different really strands of thought. One of them is contractualism, that is based on the shura and ikhtiyar ideology that we see it in the first two, especially the first 2 or 3 centuries of Islam. Then we have the idea of God, deputyship, khilafatullah. Then we have the idea of the imam, like in Shiism and also in Sunnism. and also we see the idea of Mahdi. These are really what I call the four modes of the imamate. And when you compare them to the idea of sovereignty, that you're going to see that they are different from each other. I know I am, short of time in here, but indulge with me just a little bit more. I mean, you can see in here, I mean, if you put it on a table, in the idea of contractualism, God, you have the prophet and the scripture as basically foundation of authority. Then you have the community, and the caliphs come as basically representing the community. In God's deputyship, this organization changes a little bit in here, as you can see, but nevertheless, the community is fundamental. But it comes after God's caliph, because now God's caliph is more, directly responsible, to God. And the imamate, we have a similar mode, and the idea of Mahdi, we have a similar mode as well. I mean, I think we need to remember that the authority always goes back either to the community or to the religious law, like divine law, as I call it, deen, and God. Here is the difference between the two. In the idea of siyasa, you see this duality. They make, including Abdul Hamid, well, later Abdul Hamid, that I call, I distinguish between earlier Abdul Hamid and later Abdul Hamid. Later Abdul Hamid, but particularly Ibn al-Muqaffa made this distinction very clear. God is everybody's God. But, history, time, that when we think about it, then you have the set of religion that follows, this pattern: religion, prophets, religious law, ulama, community, and the world. That, you have, ways of life, and including governance. But, in the idea of the politics, according to this view in siyasa, that, you have really, God also created kings, empires, right? And then you have the imperial law, elite, and the subject. It operates on that assumption. So these are two distinct sets. And, obviously, you can go back to the idea of, religion and mulk are twins and the like. But, I think we need to recognize that, and what this really distinction makes or creates. What kind of really life does this really presume, right? So let me go back. Well, I'm not sure if I should go back, actually. Sorry about this. So let me actually talk about just a little bit about the law, and we'll leave it at that, right, Iswan? Because I think I've been talking more than 1 hour, I guess, or approximately 1 hour.
I'm happy to listen to you.
But, maybe we can leave it to so let me see in here. So let me talk about the idea of law. Again, please go ahead and read this piece, and let me talk about this one as well. So as you can see, talk about the legal scene in the Abbasid Empire under Al-Mansur, and trying to figure out what is going on in here, and what to suggest about actually rationalizing it and controlling it. And he continues with his recommendations, right? And you can continue to read this one as I talk about what I get out of this. So, what I see in this passage, these two passages and the related discussions in the Risala about law, is that here religion obviously plays a part, but its function is being specified in here. Well, he makes two categories. One, part of religion is not open to interpretation. He talks about them as, azaim ad-din, right? Azaim ad-din, major rituals, penal laws, and obligations. These are something that are really definitive. Not the caliph, not the caliph himself, not the ulama and not the community have any authority to alter them. And then there is another part where you have actually where it is open to interpretation. And this is really includes the rest in religion. Everything else is on the table we can discuss, including obviously, the authority and the matters of authority and matters of rule. And Joseph Laurie has written an article about this subject, as some of you may know, and I think I would recommend it to read it in this context. But I'd like to add one more point that I think he misses. The distinction is not just between what is interpretable and what is not interpretable in no. He makes three categories that I divide into two. Now, because my intervention in here, I divide them into two. One, religious law, interpretable, not interpretable. And the second category is the category of reason, whose function is open-ended. And that is really independent judgment that pertains to life events and that pertains to the authority of the caliph. And here you can see, he talks about it really, we need to see it with that kind of really a notion to understand how clearly he proposes three different law codes. One is that religious obligations that nobody has an authority over, including the caliph himself. The religious authority that is open to interpretation, only the caliph has authority over in collaboration with the ulama, right? And he talks, about very specific details how that is going to proceed. And three, that the field of reason that is independent from the religious law, that is also a prerogative of the caliph. And obviously, you can think about this as, absolutism. You can think about it as basically authoritarianism, which might be, true as well. But we don't have to think about it that way as well. Is that, I'd like you to think about it the following way as well. What kind of really political practice this potentiates in terms of governing the empire? What kind of institutions, what kind of lifestyles would this create if you sit down and study its details? Okay, so, just, give me a couple of minutes. I think I'm going to be stopping in here. Maybe there will be question we can talk about later on. But let me summarize a couple of points in the discussion, because I don't have time to talk about them. So in order to make this argument about the distinction between the imamate and siyasa, and to really substantiate and ground my discussion of good governance and secularity, I start my discussion about the caliphate and how the practice of the caliphate up until the middle of the 8th century created a setting in which the intellectuals in the 8th century, thought about politics. One is that obviously with the creation of the caliphate is the entanglements of faith with politics, with empire building. That creates really a particular reality for the people living in the empire. And the other one is the formation of the empire itself over the course of a century. Institutions, discourses, practices, right? Both intellectual, cultural capital, and the kind of really reality in which these intellectuals operated. Then, I talk about the major aspects of the imamate discourse in the 8th century. To argue that the discourse on imamate emerged from the late 7th century onward as the political language of the ulama, who defined and guided the caliphate as pastoral authority and imagined social organization to be a religious affair coterminous with the religious community. And this is really something that does not stay at that. If you look at the writings of Al-Ambari, Abu Yusuf, later on other scholars as well, you are going to see that at least, for example, late 8th century juristic text developed in the context of siyasa, as I mentioned, and they brought it into the discussion of imamate, and therefore they shaped the imamate discourse moving forward. Then I talk about the emergence of political prose in the middle of the 8th century in the context of the Salem school of siyasa, non-Arab bureaucrat intellectuals, and they really just both opportunities and challenges that intervened in otherwise a discursive field that was dominated by religious scholars. And in the third chapter deals with Abdul Hamid and the rise of the political prose, and the fourth chapter deals with Ibn al-Muqaffa and his writings, and also a discussion of the epistle itself. In the following chapter, I talk about the distinction between the caliphal authority and the kingly authority. The distinction between the caliph and the king, between sovereignty and the caliphal authority, and therefore the distinction between siyasa and imama in terms of really forms of rule. Then, in the following chapter, I talk about the imperial law, and this is really, if I want to, I want to crystallize it in really just in a sentence. I argue that the notion of law for the empire, that Ibn al-Muqaffa is trying to bring, potentiated a new legal practice to compete against the idea of empire for the sacred law. That's what the ulama basically were arguing, right? And I talk about the details of that in the chapter. Then there is a fascinating discussion about territoriality that I think is also something very new to political discourse, that scholars do not really tend to even pay attention to this problem. The imamate discourse of the 8th century, even later imamate discourse, probably maybe we can see it in al-Mawardi slowly maybe emerging, but not even that, with the territorialized political thought, a political thought that is considered universal, transcendental, not bound by a territory. They, we see the distinction between Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam emerging in the middle of the 8th century as well, but it is never thought about as really just political territory, which Ibn al-Muqaffa does, I think that, I point out. So he think about the caliphate as a territory ruled by a sovereign, then therefore, including imperial subjects that have their values within that territorialized realm. And I talk about that, in the context of imperial subject later on as well. So the idea of territoriality is, I think, another important subject that we need to think about. And that, brings me to the idea of imperial subject, and I will stop, at that. Then again, compared to the idea of Muslim believers, non-Muslim subjects, or non-Muslim population, deterritorialized, depoliticized body or collectivities of people in the imamate discourse, we see that Ibn al-Muqaffa, by talking about the Sahaba, the caliph's privy, by talking about imperial elites, he also creates the notion of imperial subjectivity, that he talks about them as political subjects in the sense that they are actually responsible for their kings, responsible for paying taxes, responsible for obeying the laws, and are entitled to certain rights because of these obligations. We talked about this with Iswan before, just very briefly, that I elaborated on this a lot in my book, is that this is a guy who lives in the middle of the 8th century. The idea of the idea of Islam or Muslims, or the idea of Muslims, should be really apparent, obvious to him. The idea of non-Muslim subjects of the empire also is very obvious, evident to him, but he never talks about them. He does not mention them. I mean, even the name Muslim comes only a few times in a very specific places where he means Muslim subjects of the empire. So, I mean, what I am arguing in here is that he's trying to create a notion of imperial subjectivity beyond or above religious background, religious community. That, talk about the imperial subjects as imperial subject, and therefore politicizes the notion of the inhabitants of the caliphate itself. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and just go ahead and talk about, ask your questions. We can talk further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayrettin. That was an incredible talk. Yes, I wouldn't have thought that after having written about 1,000 pages on Ibn al-Muqaffa in my life so far, I can hear so many new things about him in an hour from a person whose work I've been actually reading, and we have been in discussion about it. That's fascinating. Before I open the floor to the questions, I would like to highlight something you said at the beginning, and kind of summarize maybe say my impression of what you said, because it's, I think, extremely important that by the fact that we name this Islamic empire and we talk about Islamic political thought. Interestingly, when we talk about the Byzantine Empire, we talk about Byzantine Empire, not the Christian Empire. That this naming has immense implications on how we understand the whole thing, and that's why we centralize the role of religion much more than possibly than we should, and that's why we centralize the role of the ulama much more probably than we should. So it leads to a completely distorted image on the whole venture as altogether, and I never managed to understand this, and I think it's an immensely important contribution, and that's why because there is always this unease with using secular in pre-modern times, how secular, and it is also because we overemphasize the religion, and then to try to compensate this, we use secular, and neither of them is really fitting. But well, we use, of course, we have to deal with categories which are in our brain. Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you very much for this. Another point is on just a sentence on which we disagree, or actually I don't think we disagree, but it's a very important point to mark, because that's also how words are ingrained in our mind. Is to say Ibn al-Muqaffa was not a philosopher. Is to say Ibn al-Muqaffa was not a philosopher. If we really take seriously what we mean by philosophy, that is wisdom, the love of wisdom, and really deep thinking about the utmost issues. Obviously, he is a core, a very important philosopher, and also, well, this hasn't come out yet, but I argue that the fact that in the Kalila Wadimna, the word philosopher appears, and it is the philosopher who speaks. It shows that these people introduced philosophy and the idea of philosophy into the Islamic, and they considered themselves philosophers. Yeah. And
so
also,
I'm not going to contest you on that.
I thought maybe, yeah, because obviously all what you presented shows that, It's just that we, there are these categories, what we mean by philosopher. And then it's all defined by present scholarship, which is biased against advanced literature. So yes, and well, being a philosopher, that's one more thing. I think he's even a philosopher in that sense that as later philosophers saw themselves as being the real ruler. So that there is this agenda behind all his writings, that the real people to rule should be those who have the reason, and they have to kind of lead the ruler, because we cannot expect rulers to have really the reason. We can hope for it, but it rarely happens. So okay, I assume there are plenty of questions. I have in the, I don't know how many. So I close this. Thank you very much again, Hayrettin, and I close the recording and open the floor for questions.
Yeah.